My name is Peter Petkov. I'm one of the editors of the Oxford Journal of London Religion, and I have been engaged with the relationship between religion and sustainable development within the margins of G20. So the purpose of these gatherings is twofold. So on the one hand, we use it as a brainstorming opportunity to prepare for the next G20 summit and the topics we're likely to engage with, discuss, explore, develop, and translate into policy recommendations, articles, hopefully books, and different venues, the European Academy of Religion including, are the opportunity to get together, bring new people in within the fluidity of this event, which hosts more than 1,000 people in Bologna. And because Bologna is such a medieval city, we have adopted a medieval gloss format of our conversation. So we come together from different parts of the world, but also from different contexts of the European Academy of Religion. And sometimes our engagements are planned, sometimes they're accidental, but they create the melting pot which we need to create in order to push some of the ideas we have also already developed, but also to find some new ideas and approach them through new and interesting angles. So in that sense, for those of you who expect that these sessions are going to be a magisterial level of lectures, maybe it's time, now is the right time to do a run-up, because in fact this is supposed to be very rigorous roundtables, deep-end discussions of things that we have identified as cutting-edge issues that we have to engage with. In addition to our focus on religion and sustainable development within the G20 context, we also use those sessions as preparatory sessions for the UK Ministerial on International Religious Freedom, which is about to kick off in London on the 5th and the 6th of July. And again, this is an opportunity to do a deep dive in some of the issues we will be exploring there. And that range from hate speech, legal protection of religious cultural heritage, religion and security, religion and the environment, to name a few. And we are not hoping to set things in stone or come to solid conclusions as a result of our conversations, but we're certainly hoping that this will be an opportunity to bring some new angles of existing, in connection with existing projects, and perhaps identify new projects which have remained untapped. These events were possible with the generous co-sponsorship of a number of organizations which have brought financial support as well as speakers to us, and we're very grateful for them. And now I would like to ask Cole to say a few words about the G20 Interfaith Forum, since he has been the main mastermind behind it. And after that, we'll just kick off with the first session.
So, let's see. I don't project quite as well as Peter, so I hope this is picking up all right on Zoom. We apologize for any complexities people have faced connecting up this morning. Let me just say again, my name is Cole Durham. I'm the president of the G20 Interfaith Forum Association, and I'm very pleased to be here, and also want to thank others who have joined. We've had a long partnership with KAISID, who will be speaking. People from KAISID will be speaking at one of the sessions later today, and we worked very closely with them when Saudi Arabia was the host country, and continue to hope to work with them and appreciate their being here. Let me just say a word about the G20 Interfaith Forum. this has been a process that's been going on. It has antecedents that go way back, as long as there's been a G20. But essentially, we have been doing meetings since 2014, when Australia was the host country. And in each year, we've found ways to do things to meet up with the host country, and to really work on making substantive contributions to what's going on. The G20 is, by its nature, primarily about global economics and finance. The G20 emerged initially as a result of the 2008 crash. But over the years, each host country has the right to select its own priorities for what gets emphasized. And so, sorry for that little disturbance. What I was going to say is that there's been a pattern for the last decade, going on a decade at least, of focusing, in addition to financial matters, on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we will be spending a lot of time on those issues in this session. As Peter indicated, we've developed a pattern over the years of trying to do pre-meetings in advance of the actual summit, be able to really make substantive contributions. We need to develop policy issues that really make sense in the G20 context. And for that to happen, it's helpful to meet in advance and to bring experts like are coming together. We're especially grateful to be able to do this here. Many of you would know that the last G20 Interfaith Forum was held last fall here in Bologna, with Alberto Maloney being one of the key movers and shakers for that event. And we've been very grateful for his support in this meeting that's going on here as part of the European Academy of Religion. So without more, I'm going to just turn things over with thanks to Peter for arranging things with all the panelists, and we'll turn things over back to Peter at this point.
Thank you, Cole. Well, dear colleagues, it gives me great pleasure to open the first panel with great colleagues and friends. Peter Francois from Oxford and Audrey Kitagawa, who has been extremely important person to run the anti-racism working group within the G20 Interfaith Forum. She has brought some new dimensions of the conversation and new aspects which we probably didn't think very much about until she joined us, and since then she's been a tour de force, because I can't imagine that there is any other working group within the G20 Interfaith Forum which is as active as the anti-racism group under her leadership. And we've done plenty of things together and have co-conspired to do even more things in the future. Peter Francois is a friend and a colleague. We usually meet and plot in our garden to do great things, but this does not compare to the great things he's doing with a wonderful project he's directing at the moment, which is funded by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office and focuses on religious freedom. Peter is, among other things, a very high-end empirical scholar, and I thought this was an opportunity to actually bring new perspectives in our conversations on religion and sustainable development, which really look into empirical data and empirical evidence in terms of linking the correlation between freedom of religion or belief and sustainable development. So, without further ado, I will now give a chance to our speakers to actually share their ideas with us, and so I could shut up. Peter, over to you.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone, and thank you, Peter, for that introduction. As Peter already indicated, I would like to use this slot as an opportunity to showcase to you all my project on freedom of religion or belief, the Leadership Network. And it's in a way the first time we are introducing this network to both an academic and a policy audience. So FORBLN, which is, and the full name is Freedom of Religion or Belief Leadership Network, is a consortium made out of 9 partners, and it has a research and an operational side of things. And as Peter already indicated, it's funded by the FCDO for 4 years, and we are more or less at the midway point of the project. The project has 2 aims, a twofold aim. On the one hand, and that's the operational side of things, it's about increasing awareness of FORB and FORB issues, and we are targeting mainly 2 groups. It is parliamentarians or political leaders on the one hand, and faith leaders on the other. And we are not interested solely in addressing and in promoting FORB towards those 2 groups, but we are especially interested in furthering dialogue between the 2 groups. The second aim is to increase the knowledge base and the understanding between FORB, freedom of religion or belief, and the promotion thereof on the one hand, and the resilience of societies, the levels of peacefulness, equality of societies. And the project focuses on fragile states, and we are mainly focusing on 8 countries. And those countries are Sierra Leone, the Gambia, Ghana, Uganda, Tanzania, Malawi, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So the aim at the operational side of the project is to create 8 regionally coordinated and owned networks. And these can involve center around a parliamentary caucus that is already in existence or that we are setting up, or about an interreligious council. It's deliberately not global, so we do not necessarily want to have one global debate about freedom of religion or belief and leadership. Instead, we opted to have 8 locally owned networks, and we hope that continuation of those 8 networks is really the legacy of the project. To do so, we also designing a toolkit to help leaders to be advocates of FORB, and that's in a way, with leaders, we mean in a way high-end leaders, about the level of a bishop, let's say, and parliamentarians, but also very much we're focusing on emerging leaders. So we're focusing on youth, and in minority groups as well. Part of the toolkit, we are putting together briefing papers. So Marie-Jules Petersen of the Danish Institute for Human Rights succinctly summarized what leaders need to take on board on FORB and the social development goals, on FORB and education, FORB and freedom of expression, FORB and education. So, and we have organized in that context a series of engagement events of which 80 leaders were present, at least, and to have a discussion on that. There are in a way no surprises in these toolkits and in these briefing papers, because it summarizes the existing literature, existing toolkits, and also the grey literature. Just a few highlights, or more for this audience, reminders of what came out. Firstly, it's important to realize that that FORB focuses on individual rights and not solely on group rights. So FORB is much more than talking about religious minorities. We're also inclusive of people with no faith. So humanists, atheists are also encompassed in the FORB agenda. We're focusing on the state as the main duty bearer of securing FORB rights, but also engage with non-state actors. And we are obviously also, the document stresses how freedom of religion or belief intersects and links up with other human rights. So it's a full part of the Agenda 2030 of leaving no one behind. Now, if you go to the document on our website on forbln.net, you will find all these documents in full detail, and also how we try to link FORB with the specific SDGs. However, as I mentioned, our project is much more than simply advocacy work, how important that might be on its own right. We're also very much about deepening an understanding between the FORB agenda and creating an empirical basis on which to claim the FORB agenda. So in a way, as a disclosure, I'm not a FORB advocate who then goes into research. I am very much a researcher who is interested in testing social sciences theories rigorously, and I have focused on FORB recently over the last 2-3 years. So one of my main things that I always try to do is to move away from shallow time data sets with a shallow time dimension, just a few years, a decade, a couple of decades, and actually focus my attention to richer and more deeper time data sets. So we can actually quantitatively engage with them and unpack what is a correlation and what is causation. And I'm going to pick up that point later. And I'll start with an observation here. I think at the same time, there's a lot of data and a lot of work already done, and there's also very little data. And with that, I mean that there is quite a good selection of articles and books already written on FORB and the data sets behind it. But at the same time, all the data sets in which these studies are based are often the same 2, 3, 4 data sets, and they are very specific. So, and I think the second observation is that I have a respect for the difficulty to put those data sets together. It is very hard to find data sets focusing on the right of individuals to change, adopt, and practice their beliefs. If you go to historical data often pushes you to data focusing on groups rather than individuals. Especially the further you go back in time, the sparser the evidence becomes on individuals. Second source of data are survey data. It is sometimes hard to pick up with survey data, data focusing on meaningful minorities, meaningful exceptions to religious tolerance. If you go to country level reports, again, these are great data sets, but they sometimes suffer from a lack of lower level granularity. And I really think that in order to better and fully understand FORB, we need to bring new data sets to the table and understand really the dynamics of within religious tolerance and FORB, and also how things change over time. My project does not offer the golden bullet here. I'm sure if there was a golden bullet, it would have been done a long time ago by many of the good scholars that have looked at FORB before. Instead, what we try to do is put together a series of high-risk attempts to broaden the data sets. And with anything like high risk, it is quite possible that we fail. Just by focusing on 5 or 6 of these attempts, we hope that at least 1 or 2 will work out. And here I would like to focus on one such attempt. So I'm talking about how to bring historical data, how to bring the time dimension to the table. It is one thing to say, to observe a correlation between religious tolerance, freedom of religion or belief on the one hand, and say it correlates well with democracy, it correlates well with wealth, equality in societies, and so on. And it basically is part of such a package. The question is FORB driving this? Or is FORB essential to maintain the package? Or is FORB, at the other end of the extreme, simply a byproduct of other forces? So basically the real question is not correlation and putting FORB within the wider package, but really focusing at causation. To what extent does FORB, religious tolerance, drives democracy, equality, wealth, and so on? And I don't want to make the distinction between correlation and causation too hard, and it's definitely not a story between good or bad. As I already mentioned, it's quite possible that FORB and religious tolerance is a key ingredient to maintain the package, and it doesn't mean that it drives it. I also warned you that I don't have the golden bullet, so with my historical work we already have to weaken the definition of FORB, as it's been said many times ago, especially in the legal context of human rights, and really start focusing more on the religious tolerance, simply because there is the data for historical periods. So what do I mean with my historical approach? What I do is I use the Seshat Global History Databank approach, of which I'm one of the founding directors, which in a way is a kind of, if you think about it, a kind of world history quantified approach. So within our database, we're asking roughly 2,000 questions for each year from the Neolithic Revolution to today, and for each geographic point in the world. So, as you can imagine, this is an enormous amount of data. It's an enormous amount of variables, it's an enormous time span, and it's an enormous geographic scope. And we do so that the data comes in a statistical format, and this allows us to create indexes. For example, a global peace index. We have a historical volatility index. We have a religious tolerance index, and so on and so forth. And then we can link that with levels of social complexity, levels of peacefulness, levels of social cohesion of societies, levels of equality, wealth, and so on. So it really allows us to focus at things we're interested in, religious tolerance, folk, religion, more generally, and to basically measures of the well-being of a society. And then our datasets allow us to query that and pick up patterns. So we can look at regional patterns, we can look at the global, of course. We can also look at certain phases and key transition points. So suppose the emergence of the state is one of them. But we can also focus on types of societies. So as I mentioned, our project was focusing on fragile states. We can look at it and say, what does fragile states make unique in our sample of societies? What makes intractable conflict, societies with an intractable conflict? What does it makes it unique in terms of religious tolerance and so on? And because it's in a statistical format, we not only have to eyeball trends and say, well, religious tolerance and folk are going up or down, but we can actually statistically deep dive into the temporal dynamics of it. So what are my religious tolerance variables that we've been looking at? Of course, here I need to acknowledge some of the previous work already done, especially by Jonathan Fox and Brian Grimm, who have done excellent work on these topics and have sets of variables already there. We try to incorporate many of these variables. Obviously, sometimes we could copy a variable like for like, and often we have to focus more on historical proxies, simply because we do not have data on individuals. Borrowing from them, we are focusing both on governmental restrictions and societal restrictions. And here I'm talking about the right to worship, the link with buildings, if there's a violence focused on people who change their religion, religious minorities, and so on and so forth. So in total, we have around 30 of these variables. And I will conclude with that, my talk. It's very much work in progress. As I mentioned, we're in the midway point of the project. And I would say more or less of all the historical known societies in our database, we have coded already 60 to 70% of those. So we're probably having another 9 months to a year work to have the full data set, after which we can start analyzing and really understand the temporal dynamics. Now, as I also mentioned, this is only one step of our research agenda. We are actually interested in linking this part of the research agenda with much richer survey data, focusing on the 8 countries specifically. We are also linking it with interventions we are planning around cross-barrier leadership, but that's obviously a topic for a next talk. And I'm going to pass over the floor to my colleague. Thank you.
So thank you, Peter. Also, Paul, for your introduction, and Peter for your wonderful presentation. So, I really want to say welcome to everyone who's online, and that it is really a privilege to share about the Anti-Racism, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiative and the commitment and interfaith dialogue within the agenda of the G20 Interfaith Forum. I think we can all recognize that racism is a problem with a very long and complex history, and while much work has been done by many institutions, from governments, the United Nations, UNESCO, and faith-based organizations, we really have to understand that racism remains a deeply ingrained, substantial systemic problem on so many levels. And the Statement of Principles on Eliminating Racism in All Its Forms, which the Anti-Racism Initiative of the G20 Interfaith Forum issued in August of 2020, indicates that the G20 Interfaith Forum is a network of religiously linked institutions and experts, quite active since 2014, as Cole indicated, and provides a regular platform for religious voices to engage with the G20 process in framing global policy initiatives. And we cannot, of course, speak for religious communities, but the IF20 has earned credibility over time, and to help, channel distinctive religious organizations to provide insights to the G20 policy formation processes. And our mandate obliges us to bring faith and public policies together So the exercise of that mandate demands a recognition that racism, far from an isolated issue, infects every aspect of human endeavor and planetary existence. And the G20 Interfaith Forums, or IF20 for short, Anti-Racism Initiative mandate is to remain sensitive to the impact of racism as a cross-cutting issue for IF20 and G20 comprehensively, especially in the G20's pursuit of full compliance with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And the initiative assumes explicit responsibility within the IF20 to work towards the eradication of racism and advancing the goal of racial equality and equity by every means available. And the 1963 United Nations Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which solemnly affirms the necessity of speedily eliminating racial discrimination throughout the world in all its forms and manifestations, and securing understanding of and respect for human dignity of all persons, convinced that any doctrine of superiority based on racial differentiation is scientifically false, morally condemnable, socially unjust and dangerous, and that there is no justification for racial discrimination in theory and in practice anywhere. The Anti-Racism Initiative affirms its commitment to and support of all international instruments outlawing racism in all its forms, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, among others. People are never to be commodified or instrumentalized, but should be cherished. As people of faith, we do affirm the precious worth of every life as an obvious consequence of divine love and compassion. The Anti-Racism Initiative, through its webinars, attempts to bring public awareness, information, and education on the various forms of racism, and it initiated the following webinars on the First Nations people in Canada: responses to anti-Asian hate crimes, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, and the systemic racism which they face, Black Lives Matter and the structural racism, bigotry, and inclusion or exclusion of which Black people face, racism in the media, manufacturing hate, ecological racism and deep-sea mining in the Pacific, education for assimilation and the lasting consequences of Indian boarding schools, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and an upcoming webinar on the Pope's apology to the cultural and racial assimilation of the First Nations peoples in Canada. The Anti-Racism Initiative will also deal with Hinduism and religious literacy, ecological racism, apartheid and globalization, and a host of other manifestations of racism, whether institutional, structural, systemic, cultural, and otherwise. You know, many years ago, I had a very wonderful friend by the name of Dr. Hans-Peter Dürr, and may he rest in peace. And he was the executive director of the Max Planck Institute and an eminent nuclear and quantum physicist. He was one of the primary authors of the Potsdam Manifesto, and he indicated that a rethinking towards a more holistic view and behaviors had to take place. He said that creativity, differentiation, and connectedness are basic characteristics of life, and the future is essentially open. However, this future would require us to learn to think in a new way, and it is obvious that the existence-threatening problems of humankind are human-made, and so we must find solutions through new behaviors and thinking that must express cooperation. So cooperation was very much of a key word for him. And he said this wide variety of crises today confronting us and threatening to exceed our ability to cope are the expression of a mental crisis in the relationship between us humans and our living world. They are symptoms of deeper causes. They are closely connected with the materialistic, mechanistic worldview favored all over the world today, and with its prior history of the progressing uniformity of all ideas of the value of affluence, habits of consumption, and economic strategies based on the pattern of a Western American European knowledge society. And that is a quote taken directly from him. And he said the image of a world assembled from dead matter is superseded by a cosmology that is based on an immaterial, omniconnected, and what is inherently alive. And the Potsdam Manifesto indicated that humankind is not imprisoned in its self-constructed conditions, but as a result of an animated, basically cooperative embedding capable of acting and transforming. He wrote, "For omniconnectedness, which we can also call love, and from which life springs, is fundamentally inherent in us and in everything else." So Alfred North Whitehead, the famed process philosopher, argued that there is urgency in coming to see the world as a web of interrelated processes of which we are integral parts, so that all of our choices and actions have consequences for the world around us. His work influenced John Cobb, a theologian at Claremont School of Theology and creator of the term that is that he basically coined ecological civilization. And he recently launched the Living Earth Movement, which is a conglomeration of diverse people and organizations who believe in global cooperation for the sake of all life on our planet, beginning with the US and China, two of the most powerful countries in the world, economically and politically. And they seek to promote a new civilization that lives in harmony with the rest of the ecosphere. Professor Charles Marsh of University of Kansas contends that cooperation and building positive relationships is a superior practice to conflict and competition. So here we see an actual shift in the mindset and new evidence from scholars, particularly in psychology and neuroscience, shows that one of the most important ways to increase cooperation is to empower women, ensuring that they have equal access to education and leadership positions and are not socially subservient to men. And what we are seeing more and more of is the cooperative engagement of civil society, of which communities are playing an instrumental role. And these collaborations are creating global movements that address global issues such as the environment, healthcare, the hungry, and services to the poor and marginalized. There are common threads of underlying threats that connect the religious traditions of the world, such as brotherhood, charity, love, and the ethic of reciprocity or the golden rule, which appears in all of the major faith traditions and sacred texts in some form. His Holiness the Dalai Lama said every religion emphasizes human improvement, love, respect for others, and sharing other people's suffering. Collaboration, cooperation, and meaningful communication among the major religions and faith traditions can bring us to that critical tipping point for positive transformation by focusing on mankind's interconnectedness and shared values, which can shift the balance from conflict and disaster towards global peace and a better future. While many are rightly concerned over the daunting challenges faced by mankind on many fronts, others see it as an opportunity to motivate people around the world to bring about changes, especially in the face of failed states who cannot provide services to its citizenry. Since the majority of people in the world consider themselves adherents to some faith tradition, the impact of religious and interreligious engagement has really great potential. And religions have always had an impact on believers' worldviews, values, and morals, and can engage a broad audience that respects their moral authority. And religious organizations have institutional and economic resources, and they can provide connectivity and social capital to achieve goals. The G20 Interfaith Forum, through the lens of interfaith, work with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the concerns of the G20, which, as we all know, meets regularly to coordinate a global policy on trade, health, climate, and other issues. And I would like to share about the vibrant role which communities of faith plays. And in a research study entitled Civic Engagement at Faith-Based Institutions, JWEB said, faith and faith-based organizations form important parts of the social capital that makes communities strong and vital, and when absent, weak and vulnerable. EB notes that religions and faith move individuals to service, which is a demonstration of their faith. Religious leaders are trusted voices in their communities and can motivate and mobilize their constituents to positive action on local, national, and international issues. And faith-based organizations can interpret global secular frameworks, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, into local religious cultural contexts and understand the cultural or religious concerns of the SDGs. They can help navigate the implementation of the goals in a contextually sensitive and sustainable way, and religious leaders and faith-based organizations are instrumental in the goal of leaving no one behind because of their close community links. And I think we can see the connection between the data that Peter was speaking about previously, and I think, examining the role of faith-based organizations would be a critical aspect of the data accumulation. As a leading guiding institution, taking the example of the United Nations now, we see how it has grown in its engagement with the NGO world and especially the faith-based organizations. For example, the UN Multi-Faith Advisory Council, which is established in 2018, consists of more than 40 religious leaders and heads of faith organizations. And the council convenes faith-based partners as advisors to the United Nations in their human rights, peace and security, and sustainable development efforts, and is connected to upholding multilateralism and international human rights through multi-faith collaboration around Agenda 2030. An international decade for a culture of peace and nonviolence for children of the world recognized interfaith efforts towards peace. UNESCO International Decade of Rapprochement of Cultures sought to enhance interreligious and intercultural dialogue and promote tolerance and mutual understanding. World Interfaith Harmony Week, observed annually, goes beyond establishing a baseline of tolerance to emphasize improved communication, acceptance, and understanding, and establishing common ground among different religious and faiths through joint celebrations and global events. So this is the experiential, personal aspect that is being welcomed here by the United Nations. UNFPA, UNICEF, and the World Food Program all consider faith and interfaith partnerships to be essential to meeting their objectives. And UN Alliance of Civilizations emphasize the mutual respect for diverse faiths and cultures as a bedrock of world peace, and that understanding and accepting differences in religious beliefs are the foundations of sustainable development. Prosperity and well-being demands that people coexist in full respect of their diversity. So there are two very significant initiatives undertaken by the United Nations that have really harvested the tremendous resource of the faith communities, and that is the Faith for Earth initiative of UNEP. And this initiative, established in 2017, partners with faith-based organizations to work towards the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. And it focuses on three overarching goals: 1, empowering leadership; 2, mobilizing faith-based investments; and 3, providing faith science evidence. And the initiative explores various theological views of world religions towards the environment, demonstrating the connection between faith and nature. And the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative is a successful multi-faith alliance that brings moral agency and faith-based leadership to the global effort to end tropical deforestation. And this initiative is under the aegis of the UN Environment Program, which was launched in 2018, and it was endorsed in 2019 at the 10th Religions for Peace World Assembly, where over 900 religious leaders agreed to restore the planet's rainforests. And it provides a global platform for religious leaders, indigenous peoples, governments, civil society organizations, and businesses to work together to protect rainforests and safeguard the indigenous peoples who serve as their guardians. Now, I also want to mention the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, which FOR for short, which is a database on religious engagement on the environment. And Peter, you may be interested in this particular initiative because FOR publishes books, articles, and newsletters on initiatives led by different religious traditions and is an international multi-religious project that promotes the moral force of religious environmentalism. So FOR identifies ecological and justice perspectives in the scriptures, rituals, contemplative practices, and moral and ethical commitments of the world's religions to find collaborative solutions to the global economic crisis. To this end, FOR partners with scientists and policymakers and dialogues with religious spiritual communities. And FOR's vision is a flourishing earth community where religious and spiritual traditions join together for the shared well-being of ecosystems, life forms, and people on our common planetary home. So the goal of interfaith coalitions is not a fusion or uniting of religions, but finding alignment in the splendor of our diversity and coming together to create a global movement and movements for positive transformation to make this world a world of peace. As we continue to explore and analyze not only our past, present, and future possibilities as we exist within the infinite power of our own potentiality, let us remember the beautiful words of Rumi, who said, "Beyond the rightness or wrongness of things, there is a field. I'll meet you there." Thank you.
Well, when we started planning those conversations, we were aware that there is a lot of overlap between the different projects we work on, and we're very interested in connecting them to really see the different overarching themes from religious cultural heritage and holy sites, tangible and intangible aspects of religious cultural heritage, hate speech, anti-Semitism, security, anti-racism. How do they really reflect these overarching themes overlapping in increasingly complex ecosystems, which are the focal point of a lot of things we tend to talk about when we work our way through the UN Sustainable Development Goals? And this was the reason why we tried to bring together a larger group of people doing different things, not necessarily doing them in conjunction with us, but we just thought to experiment and see how the different projects could converge from the empirical work Peter is doing through the policy-driven work in religious leadership, which Audrey is doing, and things other colleagues already in this room are doing. So this is an opportunity to now have a good 30 minutes of Q&A and really go deeper into some of the things which are being raised. So any initial questions from the audience, or indeed questions that the speakers may have in relation to each other?
I have a question of Peter. Peter, could you give us and the audience your website again? Maybe you can cite it slowly so we can all kind of take notes on that.
So it's forln.net.
FOR
RBLN.
BLM.net.
No, N.
N.
N.net.
.net. Okay, so I'm going to repeat that for everyone in our audience, so you can be sure to go on Peter's website at www.forbln.net. Is that correct? Thank you so much. I think the data that you're gathering is just phenomenal. And I think it will help us to understand more clearly, although you said there's no golden bullet here, and the failure of the rate of failure, as opposed to success. We'll have to see how it plans out. But I think that this kind of research is very important because it also provides evidence-based data that's very important for all of us to have. So thank you so much for your important work, and I'm very happy that we're able to meet here in Bologna.
Thank you for these kind words.
Thank you.
Fascinating. And I was wondering whether I could push Audrey further in connection with your presentation, because there is obviously a very interesting interdependence between the classic questions which deal with anti-racism, but you're clearly pushing it beyond that. You're bringing together hate speech, you're bringing together the gender dimension, and a number of other aspects beyond Black Lives Matter, in a much more idiosyncratic way. And I was just wondering whether you could reflect further, how did this start, and why are you pushing things in the direction you're pushing it? Many of the discourses in connection with anti-racism are pretty partisans and focusing on pretty narrow spectrum of agendas. You're obviously trying to pull together the different agendas. Is it because you're trying to link it with sustainable development, or is it because you feel that this kind of self-serving and self-referential engagement with anti-racism is really not leading us that far, and is likely to make us hit a brick wall sooner rather than later?
Well, as I indicated in my opening remarks, that racism remains a very deeply ingrained, substantial, systemic problem on so many levels. And therefore, you have to engage interdisciplinary approaches and perspectives in dealing with racism. And with respect to the SDGs themselves, of which we have a very intimate connection in our work, we also have to be able to see how the 17 Sustainable Development Goals also has an impact on this aspect of racism. I think and importantly, it also comes down to how within the cultural context, we also address the individual mindsets, biases, etc. of every person, and help us to deconstruct calcified thinking and perspectives, whether they arose through our particular cultures, how we were raised, etc., and create this dilation to the global lens, which is filled with diversity of peoples, races, cultures, histories, etc. So this kind of broad spectrum approach that go beyond the insularity of any particular partisan perspective is very important to have. And this is part of the anti-racism initiative to bring forth this kind of webinars and educational materials and information to the public at large, to create this dilation of the lens of insularity to the global lens of engagement.
Which is very interesting, because I remember when we started doing the anti-racism working group, my initial reaction was genuinely that this has nothing to do with sustainable development, and we're probably just spreading ourselves too thin and can't quite fit it with the focus on the intersection between religion and sustainable development. But actually, your work persuaded me. You managed to convert me that in fact it's a very helpful entry point in a lot of things which we wouldn't necessarily think about. Which brings me back to Peter's presentation. Again, you're approaching this obviously through a very different route of how empirical data as well as historical research enables to cover these blind spots and entry points which are not necessarily the most obvious entry points when we approach sustainable development. I mean, did this come up as part of the project, or did you specifically, or did you try to marry it with your previous research on global history and digital humanities you have done already?
Definitely the latter. So the Seshat Global History Databank project I referred you to exists by now for 11 years. So all our data we gather on the cohesiveness of societies, the peacefulness, the level of conflict and so on exists already and is funded by other means and so on. It's really, the FCDO project allowed me to add to those existing 2,000 variables another 30, 40 of those focusing on religious tolerance. So the methodology, the statistical models, the bulk of the data and so on has been gathered already through past investments from Horizon 2020, research councils, Templeton Foundation and so on. So it's really adding crucial and key variables relating to freedom of religion, belief and religious tolerance, which only started in the last 2 years. But the bulk of the material and the methods I have adopted over the last decade or so.
And is this in a way driven by the sense that we cannot have a rigorous understanding and interpretation of data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, when it comes to the studies of religion or the studies of religious freedom, without linking it with very robust and rigorous sense of critical historical thinking?
Yes and no. I mean, the point I probably want to make is even more fundamental than that. Is that many of the social sciences theory is the test of that. So I have no problem with how the theory is formulated, which is of an exceptionally high quality. But testing the theory often happens with all very similar data sets that are relatively time shallow, as in it's survey data, and you either start gathering the data when you start working on it. So as a result, you only have a time depth of a few years, or you actually use existing data sets that are going back a decade, 2 decades, in some occasions already to 1945, but rarely after that. Now, is there value in doing that? Enormous. Does it give you all necessary answers? It doesn't. And I guess by looking at bringing in a much longer time dimension into the mix, you add just more explanatory power to the tests. You add simply yet another confirmatory test to already existing methods and approaches. And why is that important? Is that, for example, some developments just take longer time-wise. Also, the past, as a result, gives you a broader spectrum of human behavior, of societal behavior. And if you claim to study universals, for example, one of the claims is that religious tolerance and folk is always good for democracy and so on. Well, does it hold as well for very different societies in the past? And what can we see there? Thirdly, I guess there are some temporal dimensions within, society you can only explain really by looking at what the society before at the same place and time was there. And basically, by looking at the mother or the father society of that society, that explains often how the society of choice is looking like, and you need to capture that time dimension. So really, you can make that point about most social sciences theory. Now, it is especially so, and that's just my own preference. I've always worked a lot with religion and ritual data, right? And it's relatively easy to go back further in time if you focus on economics data, if you focus on agricultural data and so on. It is much less done so when you say, well, hang on, I'm going to look at a truly quantitatively and comparative study of religious data, then often the moment you push back in time, the data becomes much more flaky, uncertain, and so on. Now, this is an additional challenge, but I think one, scholars as a whole need to tackle. We can't just say it's too difficult, we're not doing it. I prefer to bring to the table one approach, open to criticism, open to improvement, of saying, how can we do that?
Wonderful. Oh,
So Peter, you mentioned in your talk that you have 8 countries that you are particularly focusing on. Could you elaborate a little bit on that in terms of what the countries are, where they are, why you chose them, and how they enrich the picture?
Sure. So most of the FCDO projects are co-created in between the consortium who would like to do development and research and the FCDO itself, right? So there is a bit of give and take there on what to focus, what not. So, for example, on the operational side of things, we only focus on those 8 countries. On many, and I will repeat again who they are in a minute. On the research side, most of our research also focuses on those 8 countries. It's only on the bit that I detailed now that we put it in a global context. So the countries we looked at are, again, Sierra Leone, the Gambia, Ghana in West Africa, and then in East and South Africa, it is Uganda, Tanzania, Malawi, and in South Asia, it's Pakistan and Bangladesh. So we look on those 8 countries. Now the FCDO had given us a list of around 25 countries on which we were allowed to focus on as we saw fit, budgetary, for research purposes. We ended up with those 8, kindly, more or less because of pragmatic reasons. A further thing is that all the posts, the diplomatic posts, in those countries also need to be on board as well. So in those 8 countries, the post welcomed our initiative, welcomed our studies, and so on.
I mean, it's fascinating. And is when you do the data analysis, is there an interfaith dimension emerging beyond the country profiles? You've obviously looked into through the historic data sets and look at also contemporary issues, but is there a message emerging in this context that particular patterns emerge in contexts which are more interfaith friendly, or in contexts which are homogeneous and pretty monolithic in terms of one majority religion and things like that? Do you get things like that out of it by accident, or they build purposefully to try to capture this sort of material?
Definitely the latter, so it's purposeful. So one of the subset of our variables really tries to get to grips how religiously diverse those societies were. So it not only captures, let's say, majority religions, minority religions, and that it just tries to break down the full spectrum of religions on the one hand, but it also tries to figure out how much syncretism there was, and that is both in belief systems, but also in the lives of individuals. So on belief systems, there is kind of new belief system emerges which borrows from existing ones, but it's so that we capture, but we also capture how do individuals in their individual choices borrow from different religions around them. For example, they go for a Catholic wedding ceremony, but they have daily prayers in a different tradition, and so on and so forth. So we definitely try to get as fully as we can a grip on how diverse societies were. Obviously, this doesn't go endlessly on. As you can imagine, gathering data on that level is immensely expensive, right? If you do it on more or less the whole of the past, we definitely have the ambition to capture that. We do it through probably 8 variables. We focus on getting a grip to that. Do we capture everything? No. Do we want to capture everything? Also no, because that would make the project prohibitively expensive. So it's a kind of a happy medium. We definitely we will be able to see if there's any traction at all in that interfaith, interreligious dialogue that we definitely should be able to tell you, and that is by research.
Cool.
So this is a question for Audrey. I know one of the issues that is really coming to the fore is the food crisis, the looming food crisis. And I couldn't help wondering, as I was listening to your presentation, what sorts of thoughts you've had about that, how much sort of racism issues interact with that. And one of the things I've been trying to think about is how we try to have impact on global leaders early, because we know that some of the timelines start in August when food starts to rot in Ukrainian silos. I'm interested in your thoughts on how we better bring those kinds of issues to the fore and have it.
Well, I think, Cole, that your question really raises the importance of our relationship with the G20 summit leaders, because, of course, it focuses on the wealthiest 20 countries in the world. And so, in many ways, now, my personal belief is that hunger and abject poverty and the food security issue is very much based on politics and the power dynamics that are involved, as we can see playing out before our very eyes in today's contemporary world. So I don't think we can exclude the impact of the political aspect on the importance of food security, but also the interconnection, the deep embedding of the transnational corporations and their close relationship, shall we say, with government leadership. And that brings us back again to the Sustainable Development Goals, the infrastructures and institutions within the last even 70 years that have been created through the many organizations of the Western powers, etc., that have set up these power dynamics that can allow this kind of disparity in different countries, and the people who are poor and are lacking in not the resources, because if you actually take a look at the world's wealthiest countries in resources, they also house the world's poorest people. Now, the deeper question is, why is this so? Why is it then when you take, for example, a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo that is wealthy, immensely wealthy in uranium, coltan, which runs all of our technologies, and, why has the fossil fuel-rich countries been so important in the geopolitical dynamics? And I will posit that this issue of access to resources, natural resources, and the economic development that has concurrently been going on, that has basically very much favored the historic power dynamics of the West, that has a hugely important colonial history, talking about historical perspectives, and the perpetuation of those power dynamics in contemporary times. And when you consider, like the Congo, as I was talking about, that has every particular resource, is one of the most wealthiest resource countries in the world, and has become environmentally degraded because of mining companies that go in there, to be able to service the national security interest of the powerful countries, to ensure that it retains its economic power. I think, this is the deeper kind of examination that needs to take place, because the ultimate result of colonialism and neocolonialism that is being expressed today very much has to do with the political wealth interests, etc., of the powerful players in the world economically. So, the G20 Interfaith Forum becomes very important in its policy recommendations and considerations. But the aspect of the deeper investigation and analysis that must take place in our work becomes extremely important. And this aspect of racism and the history of racism as expressed in the power dynamics that take place historically and in contemporaneous times must be analyzed more deeply. And it will take a lot of courage to see how we have become quite incorporated with the resource wars and the political aspects of poverty and hunger and food security with the power dynamics and the national security interests of resources to these wealthy countries. So I think this kind of analysis is very important to have. I hope I've answered your question, but it will take a lot of courage because, of course, we arise from the West. We have all benefited from what runs our technologies. And while we're talking about getting off of fossil fuels, and getting into technologies that are, away from fossil fuels. But if you've been reading, how catalytic converters and copper and all the other kinds of resources that run the new technologies are concerned, that brings another aspect of this whole issue. Again, if not fossil fuels, then it's another thing. So it is really how we are, and it goes to this whole environmental aspect. How are we treating our environment? And the impunity with which we have done that to be able to keep the power dynamics going to, basically entitled countries. Continue that. I think this kind of analysis is hugely important. And also the analysis of the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and whether or not the gross domestic production is the appropriate indicator of economic well-being, which obviously has not translated into societal well-being, community well-being, human security or well-being, but has in fact led to huge environmental degradation problems and human insecurity. So I'm very happy that you're doing this kind of research. And I think part of the IF20 is to be able to do this kind of deeper analysis and thinking into our histories and how it plays out into contemporary times. And it goes to the issue of the power dynamics that are involved.
Audrey, something related and yet unrelated to what Cole just raised. In this context, and particularly in the G20 context, there's been a growing appetite to get into the ways religious voices are likely to make a difference in engaging in a more meaningful way and more effective way with the Sustainable Development Goals. And here lies my problem. I could see that there is certainly a potential there, but at the same time I couldn't help thinking that when we bring in religious voices, a lot of them tend to be a bit disappointing. And what I mean by that is that they don't seem to have the confidence to really pitch authentic religious perspectives on those issues. They follow what the G20 governments may say. They follow their specific agendas, but there doesn't seem to be some kind of an appetite and confidence to push the boundaries and to really say, we're going to get you to think about those things outside of the box, because you need to think outside of the box for things to make a difference. I mean, when we are having these conversations, you're certainly doing that. I told you I did not believe that.
And didn't we have a convert in you already?
Anti-racism works, but in reality is you convinced me that it does fit into a particular way, and probably you would not have been able to do it if you were not being yourself. Now, I get the sense that there is a lot focus, emphasis, and investment in religious literacy for diplomats and policy makers, and we're not addressing the elephant in the room, that there is a huge deficit of religious associations and religious leaders literacy when it comes to engaging with policy issues. They seem to be able to need to be driven into that and endorse policies rather than challenging them when they really don't work. I mean, what is your sense of it? Why do you think that we have quite a gap between sort of the interest in having the religious leaders to be on the table and talk about things and engage with other things, and complete lack of ability to do so in a major way?
Well, I think it's two different levels here. One is a level where, you stick with your religion and stay out of politics. And I think that belies the fact that, historically, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, is that religious organizations have had huge impact and influence on political processes and policy. Okay, so, and oftentimes they have set the policies and practices of not only the states, but of the people in the states. So I think that, religious leaders, if they should certainly, like I have addressed, they are the moral voice, and they should be the moral voice that continuously calls out to leaders across all disciplines to remember the values and the sacred teachings of whatever context any particular religion may arise. But the values, as I indicated, have been, we all talk, all religious traditions talk about love, compassion, caring for others, and, and service to the poor, the marginalized, etc. So I think that moral voice is very important. And so when you start talking about within the political context now and the policy context, now we have to remember that the policy recommendations arise in relationship to the political leaders who ultimately will set the policies for the governments and the countries. So you will have this hesitation perhaps with the religious leaders who have sometimes been told, well, you stay in your own lane. Okay. And I think, that has been successful up to a point, because you have also, as I indicated, had the huge impact of the religious communities on policy making. So I think it's been a blend, but I think both sides, whether it's the religious communities or the political leaders, really do need to understand, more importantly, this whole aspect of power dynamics. And if we're going to take a look at the historical perspective, how they have influenced each other, how they are influencing each other in contemporary times, and what is that aspect of this, the dynamics of power. And that will ultimately bring us back to the aspect of the sacred and the values that the religious communities should be articulating, but often fall prey to themselves. So, when you're in creation, you're going to have the pairs of opposites that are always going back and forth, the good, the bad, the happy, the sad, etc. So the great traditions ultimately want to teach us how to come to transcendence, right? To transcend the pairs of opposites. In Hinduism, you call that Advaita Vedanta, so, but I think all traditions ultimately, in seeking for the divine, will have to find that pathway to transcend the dual purposes of creation. And ultimately, from there arises the power dynamics.
Peter?
Can I just also pick up on that? Your question also depends a little bit what your baseline expectation is. As in, you could say, well, there has been a discussion about the SDGs, and what does religion and religious leaders really bring to the table, which is new? Well, what if you broaden the discussion, say, let's look at business leaders. How has their engagement been? What do they bring new to the table, and so on? I mean, if you just look at the vast majority of business leaders, the interest will be relatively low. If you say, well, no, I bring together, a little bit like Brian Grimm does, or not a little bit, I mean, like Brian Grimm does, I bring together business leaders who are interested in these things and coalition almost of the willing, right? And say, like, how can we influence it? The result will be much higher. And I think it's very similar to faith leaders as well. If you say, well, give me a random sample of 1,000 faith leaders and what do they have to contribute, possibly the value will be relatively low, and they will say, well, we keep that separation, as Audrey already mentioned. However, it is definitely possible in our network, but also in many others, to bring faith leaders together and who do bring new voices to the table. So it's really, what is your baseline expectation here, I feel.
Fascinating. And we could continue this conversation forever, but since there are so many coffee addicts in this room, and Anastasia excluded, I propose that we draw this panel to a close and have a short break, and then we get together shortly to continue our conversation on our next overarching theme, which is hate speech. Okay, thank you very much. Let's have a round of applause for our speakers.